It was an ordinary Monday morning in the heart of the city, with the streets coming alive with the usual chaos. Cars honking in the distance, people hurriedly heading to work, and the hum of chatter filling the air. Darnell Carter moved steadily down the sidewalk, his pace relaxed in contrast to the frantic energy around him. Dressed in a tailored black suit with shoes polished to perfection, Darnell carried an air of quiet confidence that made him stand out in the bustling crowd. He had just finished breakfast at a local diner he often frequented, and the morning had been calm and uneventful. He enjoyed these small moments of peace before heading into the pressures of his work as a federal attorney. As he approached his parked car, a sleek black sedan, Darnell fished for his keys from his pocket, prepared to head to his first meeting of the day. His mind was already turning over the details of the case he was working on, a significant one that could have far-reaching consequences. But before Darnell could open his car door, a voice called out from behind him, cutting through the city noise like a sharp blade. "Sir, we need you to stop right there," the voice commanded, tinged with authority. Darnell turned, his hand still gripping the car keys, to find two police officers approaching him. Officer Grant and Officer Taylor, both in uniform, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was hard to ignore. They weren't just making casual conversation, they were sizing him up, already judging him from a distance. Darnell could feel the weight of their assumptions hanging in the air between them. "Can I help you, officers?" Darnell asked, keeping his tone even, though a sense of unease was already creeping in. He knew what this was. It was the same feeling he'd had so many times before, when suspicion, not reason, guided the actions of those in authority. "ID," Officer Grant barked, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. His stance, firm and unyielding, made it clear that they were already treating him as a suspect, though he hadn't done a thing to warrant it. Darnell blinked, but remained calm. His father had always taught him how to handle situations like these. Growing up as a black man in America meant understanding that at any given moment, you could be seen as a threat, even when you were doing nothing wrong. His father's advice echoed in his mind: stay calm, stay respectful, and never escalate the situation. "May I ask why you need my ID?" Darnell replied, his voice measured, though he knew where this was likely headed. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Grant said, his hand resting near his belt, a subtle signal of authority. There was no explanation beyond that, just the vague mention of a description, a term Darnell had heard too many times. It was the same vague reasoning used to stop black men across the country. A description could mean anything, and often it meant nothing. Darnell sighed inwardly but kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to challenge them directly, even though the situation already felt unjust. "All right," he said quietly, reaching into his jacket to retrieve his wallet. "But I'd like to know more about why I'm being stopped." Grant took the wallet without answering, briefly scanning Darnell's ID before glancing back up, his gaze sharp and unfriendly. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Grant asked, his tone accusatory, as if being in a particular part of town was itself a crime. "I just had breakfast," Darnell replied, gesturing to the diner down the street. "Now I'm heading to my car to get to work." "And what kind of work do you do?" Officer Grant pressed, his tone thick with skepticism. "I'm a lawyer," Darnell answered calmly. "I have a meeting in an hour." Grant's smirk faltered briefly at that, as though he hadn't expected the answer. His expression quickly hardened again, unwilling to be thrown off balance. "A lawyer, huh?" he muttered. "Well, maybe you can explain this suspicious activity in the area then." Darnell kept his voice steady, though inside his frustration was growing. He had been through these situations before, stopped and questioned for simply existing in a place where others thought he didn't belong. He had been harassed for wearing expensive clothes or driving a nice car, assumptions made based on the color of his skin rather than any actual behavior. "I'm not involved in any suspicious activity," Darnell replied calmly. "I'm just trying to get to work." Grant's eyes narrowed. He was searching for something, anything, to justify taking this further. "Got anything illegal in the car?" he asked, his tone now sharp, more aggressive. Darnell's patience was being tested, but he knew he couldn't afford to let his frustration show. This was exactly what they wanted, some sign of defiance that could be twisted into resisting or non-compliance. He took a slow breath. "No, there's nothing illegal in my car," he answered, his voice even. "You're welcome to check if you have probable cause." At that, Grant's expression shifted again. His eyes hardened, and his posture grew more rigid. He had heard enough. "Step away from the car," he ordered, his voice now carrying an edge of authority that left no room for discussion. Darnell hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. He knew that in these situations, there was little room for arguing, no matter how right he might be. The officers had already made up their minds. Slowly, he stepped back from the car, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. But just as Darnell took a step away, Grant moved in with sudden aggression. Without warning, he grabbed Darnell's arm and twisted it behind his back. The force of the movement caught Darnell off guard, and before he could react, Officer Taylor joined in, pinning him against the car. Darnell winced, the sharp pain shooting through his shoulder. "What are you doing?" he managed to ask, though the question was drowned out by the adrenaline rushing through his body. "You're under arrest for resisting," Grant said coldly as he slapped the handcuffs on Darnell's wrists, tightening them to the point of pain. Darnell's mind reeled. Resisting? He hadn't resisted at all. He had complied with everything they'd asked, yet here he was, face pressed against the cold metal of his own car, treated like a criminal for simply existing. The sensation of the cold steel cuffs around his wrists and the rough treatment from Officer Grant blurred Darnell's senses. The world around him narrowed to the moment, the biting sting in his shoulder, the tension in the air, and the sharp crack of Officer Grant's voice echoing in his ears. Darnell gritted his teeth, biting back a retort as they roughly pushed him toward the police cruiser parked just a few steps away. His heart pounded, and a heavy weight settled in his chest. The frustration he'd felt a few minutes earlier was quickly transforming into something darker, a mix of anger and humiliation. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, treated like a common criminal, handcuffed in broad daylight, in front of onlookers. As Officer Grant pulled Darnell toward the car, a shift started to happen around them. The street, which had been busy but unconcerned moments ago, now began to gather attention. Darnell could feel the eyes of the passers-by on him, some shocked, some curious, but many clearly uncomfortable with what they were seeing. Across the street, an older woman, Mrs. Agnes Carter, no relation to Darnell, stood by her apartment window, her face filled with disbelief. She had seen Darnell many times in the neighborhood, always dressed sharply, always polite. She couldn't understand why the police would be treating him this way. Her voice rang out from her window, shaky but loud enough to carry across the street. "That man hasn't done anything wrong," Mrs. Carter shouted, her voice tinged with fear and frustration. "Why are you doing this to him?" Her voice didn't go unnoticed. Others around her, commuters, pedestrians, neighbors, began slowing down, taking in the scene unfolding before them. The hum of the city's usual background noise faded slightly, replaced by murmurs of confusion and then concern. A young couple who had been walking their dog nearby stopped, both exchanging uneasy glances. The man quickly pulled out his phone, raising it to capture what was happening. "I don't like this," he muttered to his girlfriend as he started recording. "They're arresting him, but he hasn't done anything. This feels wrong." The sight of the phone outstretched toward the scene didn't escape Darnell's notice, and despite the immediate pain in his wrists, a small flicker of hope sparked within him. Maybe this time, someone was paying attention. Maybe this time there would be proof that he had done nothing to warrant the treatment he was receiving. The situation escalated faster than any of them anticipated. More people started to gather, some pulling out their phones to record, others shouting questions at the officers. "Why are you arresting him? What's going on?" Someone called out from the growing crowd. Officer Grant, visibly irritated, ignored the questions, focusing solely on getting Darnell into the back of the police car. Officer Taylor, standing slightly to the side, shifted nervously. It was clear that the growing attention was making him uncomfortable. His eyes darted between the crowd and Grant, unsure of how far this situation might spiral. Darnell didn't resist as they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, but he kept his eyes on the crowd forming outside. Through the window he could see people watching, some horrified, others recording. But it was clear that the scene wasn't sitting well with anyone. Once inside the police car, Darnell's breath came out in slow, controlled bursts. He wasn't physically resisting, but his mind raced through the possibilities. He knew that being inside this car didn't just mean a wrongful arrest. It meant something bigger. His thoughts flashed to the news stories he had seen too many times. Black men detained or worse, with their dignity stripped away by a system that had no regard for justice. And yet, this was his reality now. As the cruiser's door slammed shut, cutting off the voices outside, Darnell shifted in his seat, the cuffs digging painfully into his wrists. He watched the crowd grow larger, the voices rising louder. "You have no right," shouted a woman from the crowd, her voice filled with righteous anger. "This is not justice." The air grew heavier, thick with tension and uncertainty, but the police officers inside the car acted as if nothing was out of the ordinary. To them, this was just another routine arrest, another report to file. The thought made Darnell's stomach turn. Before the car pulled away, Darnell leaned toward the window, his voice steady. "Despite everything, this isn't over," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, his words clear and deliberate. The statement hung in the air, followed by a moment of quiet before the car engine roared to life. Darnell's words seemed to resonate, settling over the crowd like a promise. A promise that this wouldn't be just another incident that went unnoticed, swept under the rug by an indifferent system. As the police car pulled away from the curb, carrying Darnell to the precinct, the crowd outside continued to swell. The recording phones captured everything: Darnell's arrest, the officer's dismissal of the public's concern, the tension that hung like a thick fog in the air. A few blocks away, word of the incident had already started to spread. Social media lit up with videos and posts, people sharing the footage of the arrest, calling attention to the injustice they had just witnessed. What had started as a routine stop had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. The city was starting to pay attention. Inside the police car, Darnell sat quietly, his mind still racing but his outward demeanor calm. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, and this wouldn't end at the station. This was about more than his arrest. It was about the injustice that had been festering for too long, not just for him, but for countless others. He glanced out the window as the city streets blurred by, the voices of the crowd still echoing faintly in his ears. Darnell knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about him anymore. The movement had already started, and there was no stopping it now. As the cruiser approached the station, Darnell could see the looming concrete building up ahead. The police precinct was just another symbol of the system that he had spent years fighting against. But this time, he wasn't just going to be a passive observer. This time, the system had to answer for what it had done. And he wasn't going to face it alone. The police car came to a slow stop in front of the station, the concrete building looming ahead like a fortress. Darnell stared at it through the window, his thoughts racing, though his outward expression remained composed. He had been here before, not as a suspect, but in his capacity as a lawyer, advocating for others who had been caught in the gears of this very system. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, but there was little time to dwell on it now. As Officer Grant opened the door, yanking Darnell out of the back seat, the atmosphere outside the station felt different from the streets. There was no crowd here, no voices to challenge the injustice unfolding. It was quiet, sterile, the only sounds the clattering of police radios and the distant hum of traffic. But even in the absence of a crowd, Darnell knew this moment carried weight. People were watching now, even if they weren't physically present. Grant and Taylor led Darnell inside, their hands still firmly gripping his arms. The station's interior buzzed with the usual activity: officers moving through the halls, phones ringing, paperwork being shuffled from desk to desk. It was a scene Darnell had witnessed countless times, but this time, the perspective felt different. He was the one in handcuffs now, and he could feel the subtle shift in how the officers around him reacted. Some cast glances his way, quick, questioning looks, but most seemed indifferent, focused on their own work. To them, he was just another person being processed, another name to add to a growing list. Darnell noticed, however, that the tension in Officer Taylor's body hadn't eased. Taylor's grip on his arm wasn't as firm as it had been, and there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. As they reached the front desk, a tired-looking officer behind the counter barely looked up as Grant dropped Darnell's ID onto the desk. "Darnell Carter. Brought him in for resisting arrest," Grant said brusquely, his voice carrying the weight of authority, as though the mere act of stating the charge was enough to justify everything that had happened. The desk officer paused, glancing at the ID. He entered Darnell's name into the system, his fingers clacking against the keyboard. After a moment, the officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing, quickly printing out a form before gesturing to Officer Grant. "Take him to booking." Without another word, Grant grabbed Darnell's arm again, pulling him away from the desk and down a narrow hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, sterile light over the dull gray walls. It was as though the very building itself had been designed to strip away any sense of dignity, reducing everyone who walked through it to nothing more than a number. They led Darnell to a small room, where a fingerprinting machine sat on a metal table. Officer Taylor stepped forward this time, taking over the process, his movements quick and practiced, but Darnell could still sense the discomfort radiating from him. Darnell said nothing as they fingerprinted him, though the frustration simmered beneath the surface. His mind replayed the events of the morning, the casual breakfast, the walk to his car, and the sudden shift that had turned his day into a nightmare. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was being processed like a criminal. The absurdity of it all gnawed at him, but he remained outwardly calm. Reacting now wouldn't help. When the fingerprinting was done, they led him farther down the hallway, stopping in front of a small holding cell. The door creaked open, and without ceremony, they removed the handcuffs and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Grant sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound of the lock sliding into place echoing in the narrow room. Darnell stood in the center of the cell, rubbing his sore wrists, taking in the surroundings. The space was small and cold, with nothing but a narrow bench and a metal toilet in the corner. The walls were gray, institutional, designed to strip away any sense of individuality. He sat down on the bench, exhaling slowly. He knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was yet to come, and it wouldn't be fought here, inside these walls. Outside, things were already moving. The videos, the witnesses, the growing attention. This wasn't going to be swept away quietly. Darnell glanced at the door, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had spent his career fighting for justice, and now, for the first time, the system he had fought to reform was closing in on him. But he wasn't afraid. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a battle that had been building for years. As the minutes dragged on inside the cold, confined cell, Darnell's mind raced through the possibilities. He had faced plenty of injustices throughout his life, but this felt different. This was blatant, open, and recorded by more than one set of eyes. The weight of it sat heavy in the pit of his stomach. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. The metallic clank of keys rattled, followed by the creaking of the cell door. Darnell looked up as Officer Taylor stepped inside, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Captain Rodriguez, the precinct's commanding officer. Darnell recognized him immediately, a man known for his rigid approach to law enforcement and his insistence on order. But as Rodriguez stepped forward, Darnell noticed something different in his expression. There was no bravado, no arrogance. Instead, there was something closer to concern. "Mr. Carter," Rodriguez began, his voice tight, "we need to have a word." Darnell rose from the bench slowly, watching Rodriguez closely. "A word?" he asked calmly. though he already had a sense of where this was heading. His instincts told him this wasn't just about a routine arrest anymore. Rodriguez gave a curt nod. "You're being released," he said, but there was no sense of satisfaction in his tone. "We've reviewed your file and your background." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Darnell's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what did you find, Captain?" There was a brief pause before Rodriguez spoke again, his voice low but steady. "It appears you're not just a lawyer. You're a federal attorney, aren't you? Working undercover for the Department of Justice." The words landed like a blow, but Darnell's face remained calm. He could see Officer Taylor's reaction. His face turned pale, his eyes wide with shock. The realization was sinking in, and it was clear that they now understood the magnitude of their mistake. Darnell nodded slightly. "That's right," he confirmed. "I'm part of a federal investigation into police misconduct." His words were measured, calm, but they carried a weight that made the room feel even smaller. Captain Rodriguez took a step back, running a hand over his jaw, frustration flickering across his face. "This shouldn't have happened," he muttered, mostly to himself. We've made a mistake." Taylor's eyes darted toward Rodriguez, his discomfort evident. He hadn't realized the full extent of who they had just arrested, and now the consequences of their actions were becoming painfully clear. Darnell folded his arms across his chest, his gaze never leaving Rodriguez. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "This is about what your officers assumed the moment they saw me. And that's the problem you're facing, Captain. It's not just a mistake. It's a pattern." Rodriguez's face hardened, but he didn't argue. He knew Darnell was right. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on them all. "You're free to go," Rodriguez finally said, his voice low. "But this isn't over." Darnell nodded. "No, Captain. It's not." As Darnell walked out of the holding cell, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Officer Taylor stood still, his face pale, the gravity of the situation dawning on him fully. He had thought this was just another routine arrest, another man who fit the description. Now he realized how profoundly wrong they had been. Captain Rodriguez, on the other hand, wore the exhaustion of leadership. This was a mistake that could not be brushed aside or hidden. The implications of what had just happened were already rippling out beyond this room, and he knew it. The videos from earlier, the crowd outside, this was going to explode into something much bigger than either he or his department could contain. Rodriguez motioned for Darnell to follow him. "Let's talk in my office," he said, his voice low, trying to keep control of the situation. Officer Taylor moved to follow, but Rodriguez shook his head. "Stay here, Taylor. We'll handle this." Taylor remained rooted to the spot, his guilt obvious as Darnell passed by. Darnell didn't speak as they walked through the narrow corridor toward Rodriguez's office, but the tension in the air between them was palpable. Rodriguez knew he was dealing with someone far beyond his usual suspects. A federal attorney with ties to the Department of Justice didn't just disappear quietly, and Darnell wasn't someone to be intimidated. Once they entered the office, Rodriguez gestured for Darnell to sit, but Darnell remained standing, arms crossed. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Rodriguez took a seat behind his desk, leaning back with a heavy sigh. The exhaustion on his face was apparent, but more than that, there was frustration, a realization that they had stepped into something far more significant than a wrongful arrest. "Mr. Carter," Rodriguez began, his tone more measured now, "I can assure you that this will be thoroughly investigated. You have my word on that." Darnell's expression remained neutral. "I don't need your word, Captain. What I need is action. What happened out there today wasn't just a mistake. It's part of a larger issue, one your department has been ignoring for too long." Rodriguez nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he processed Darnell's words. He didn't argue. He couldn't. "I know this looks bad," he admitted, leaning forward slightly, "and I won't pretend it isn't. But this department is not beyond redemption. We can make changes." Darnell raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Changes?" he repeated. "This isn't about tweaking policy, Captain. It's about changing the entire culture in your precinct. You think this is the first time something like this has happened? Because it isn't. I've been looking into departments like yours for years, and this pattern isn't unique to you." Rodriguez's eyes flicked toward the window, where the faint sounds of the city outside buzzed quietly. He knew Darnell was right. The data was there, the stories were out there. Instances of racial profiling, misconduct, wrongful arrests. But acknowledging it meant admitting that his department was part of the problem. "And what do you suggest we do?" Rodriguez asked after a moment, his voice quieter, as if the enormity of the situation was finally sinking in. Darnell didn't hesitate. "Start with accountability. The officers involved, Grant, Taylor, they need to be held responsible. You can't protect them. If you do, you'll lose whatever credibility your department has left. The people outside, the community, they've had enough." Rodriguez's face hardened, but he didn't respond immediately. He knew Darnell was right. He had seen the videos of the arrest, the way Grant had escalated the situation without cause. There was no excuse for it, and now the department was on the line. After a long pause, Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Grant and Taylor will be suspended while the investigation takes place," he said, "and I'll ensure that the review is independent. You have my word." Darnell nodded but didn't relax. "Suspension is a start, but I'll be following up on this. And trust me, this isn't just going to go away because you think an apology is enough." Rodriguez could only nod. The captain had lost control of the situation long before they'd reached this point, and now he had to navigate the fallout. Darnell's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. More messages, more calls. People were already rallying around the story. It was only a matter of time before the media swarmed the station, demanding answers. The ripple effects of the arrest were spreading fast, far beyond the precinct. Rodriguez rose from his chair, his expression tired but resigned. "I'll take care of it, Mr. Carter," he said. "I'm sure you have things to take care of, too." Darnell stood still for a moment, studying Rodriguez's face, then gave a curt nod. "We'll see how this plays out, Captain. But this is just the beginning." As Darnell walked out of Rodriguez's office and through the station, he felt the eyes of the officers on him, some filled with confusion, others with quiet shame. The system that had failed so many had tried and failed to silence him. But now, the tables had turned. This wasn't just about Darnell anymore. It was about the community, about accountability, and about change. And there was no going back now. As Darnell exited Captain Rodriguez's office, the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air. The tension in the station was almost palpable. Officers moved briskly, their eyes darting nervously between one another, aware that something significant had happened but unsure of how it would unfold. The arrest of a high-profile federal attorney wasn't a small mistake. The consequences were looming, and everyone in the building seemed to know it. Darnell made his way toward the front of the station, his phone buzzing in his pocket with more messages and missed calls. Word was spreading fast, faster than even he had anticipated. The crowd outside, which had started with a few concerned bystanders, had now grown into a full-fledged protest. The voices of the demonstrators were no longer background noise. They were a roaring presence that the station couldn't ignore. Justice for Darnell. End racial profiling. The chants outside grew louder, and as Darnell passed by the front desk, he could see officers peering out the windows nervously. Some looked irritated, others worried, but none of them could deny that the situation was quickly spiraling out of their control. Lieutenant Thompson, a no-nonsense officer who had recently transferred to the precinct, approached Darnell as he neared the front entrance. She had watched the situation unfold from a distance, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. There was something different about her. While the other officers seemed uncertain or defensive, Thompson was focused, deliberate, as if calculating her next move. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice steady as she approached him. "We need to talk." Darnell stopped, turning to face her. He hadn't interacted with Thompson before, but he could tell immediately that she was different from Grant and Taylor. There was no aggression or hostility in her demeanor, only a seriousness that suggested she understood the gravity of what was happening. "What can I do for you, Lieutenant?" Darnell asked, his tone calm but measured. He was ready for another round of excuses or apologies, but Thompson didn't seem like the type to waste time on platitudes. Thompson glanced toward the front entrance, where the voices of the protesters continued to swell. "This is getting bigger than we expected," she said, her tone direct. "We're going to need to address it before things get out of hand." Darnell crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "I've already made it clear to Captain Rodriguez what needs to be done," he replied. "If your department doesn't act, this isn't going to go away. The community is tired of being ignored." Thompson nodded, fully aware of the stakes. "I agree, but we have to be careful about how we handle this." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "There's a lot of tension here, and if we make the wrong move, it could escalate fast." Darnell studied her for a moment, sensing the urgency in her voice. "So, what's your plan?" he asked. Thompson didn't hesitate. "We need to bring the mayor in, get her to make a statement. This isn't just a police issue anymore. It's a city issue. People are watching, and we need to get ahead of it." Darnell nodded slowly, appreciating her pragmatism. "I can work with that, but it's not just about a statement. The community wants more than words. They want action. Apologies won't fix the deeper problems." Thompson's expression remained serious. "I know that, and we'll have to face those problems head on. But right now, we need to stabilize the situation outside. If the crowd grows any larger, we're going to have a real problem on our hands." As if to underscore her point, a loud chant erupted from outside. "No justice, no peace." The energy from the protesters was reaching a fever pitch. It was clear that the crowd wasn't going to disperse without some form of acknowledgement from the department. At that moment, Officer Stevens hurried over to Thompson, his face flushed with anxiety. "Lieutenant, the media's here. They've set up just outside and they're asking for a statement. The crowd's getting bigger by the minute." Thompson's jaw tightened, and she glanced at Darnell. "Looks like we're out of time." Darnell straightened his posture, his eyes steady. "Then let's do it, but I'm telling you now, if the mayor doesn't address this the right way, if this department doesn't take real responsibility, you're going to have a much bigger problem than a crowd outside." Thompson nodded once, understanding the gravity of the moment. "I'll make sure the right steps are taken," she said firmly. Then she turned to Stevens. "Get the mayor on the phone. Tell her we need her down here now." Stevens nodded and rushed off, leaving Thompson and Darnell standing by the front entrance. The voices outside continued to grow louder, and through the glass doors, Darnell could see the signs, the faces of people who had gathered to demand justice. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. Thompson exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the growing crowd. "We'd better be ready." The tension inside the police station was mirrored by the growing energy outside. The crowd, once a few dozen, had swelled into hundreds, their voices becoming a singular force of frustration and determination. Signs bearing phrases like, "No justice, no peace," and "End police brutality" waved above the sea of protesters, while news cameras set up just beyond the police barricades, capturing every moment. Inside, Darnell stood near the front entrance, arms crossed as he watched Lieutenant Thompson and Officer Stevens prepare for the inevitable. The mayor was on her way, and everyone in the station knew they were on the verge of a public relations disaster. The media presence, the size of the crowd, and the growing online attention made it impossible for the department to ignore what had happened. "Mr. Carter," Lieutenant Thompson's voice broke through his thoughts. She approached with a sense of urgency, but maintained the same composed demeanor. "The mayor will be here in a few minutes. When she arrives, we'll be making a public statement." Darnell's eyes remained on the crowd outside. "A statement isn't enough," he said, his voice firm. "The people out there want more than just words. They want accountability, and they're not going to accept anything less." Thompson nodded, fully aware of the stakes. I agree, but we have to start somewhere. The mayor's statement will acknowledge the incident and promise a thorough investigation. We'll need you to stand with her when she addresses the crowd. Darnell turned to face her, his expression unreadable. I'll stand with her, but I'm not here to validate empty promises. If the mayor doesn't commit to real action, I'll make sure the people know this department is just covering itself. Thompson's face tightened, but she didn't argue. She knew that Darnell held more power in this situation than any of them had anticipated. The videos of his arrest had already gone viral, and the narrative was no longer under the police department's control. They were playing catch-up, and Darnell's voice carried weight. He was the one the people were rallying around. A few moments later, the doors to the station opened, and Mayor Linda Evans stepped inside. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her face tense but composed. Her presence commanded attention, and as she entered, the room seemed to still. Mayor Evans had been through crises before, but it was clear this one was different. The eyes of the city, and beyond, were on her now. Mr. Carter, the mayor greeted Darnell with a nod, her expression serious but respectful. I understand the gravity of what's happening here. I'm not here to make excuses for the department. I'm here to ensure that justice is served. Darnell returned the nod but remained skeptical. Justice doesn't come from apologies alone, Mayor Evans. The people outside want more than just words. She met his gaze steadily. I understand that, and I'm prepared to announce that we will launch an independent investigation into the conduct of the officers involved. There will be no protection for misconduct. I promise you that. Darnell didn't respond immediately, weighing her words carefully. After a long pause, he gave a curt nod. I'll stand with you. But remember, this doesn't end today. The investigation needs to be thorough, and the consequences need to be real. Mayor Evans's expression remained resolute. They will be. The door to the station opened again, and the sound of the chanting crowd poured inside. The mayor squared her shoulders, gesturing for Darnell and Lieutenant Thompson to follow her outside. Together, they walked toward the podium that had been hastily set up outside the station, facing the crowd of protesters and the sea of cameras. As they stepped out, the chanting began to quiet, though the energy remained thick with anticipation. Reporters leaned forward, microphones at the ready, and the crowd pressed closer to hear what the mayor would say. Mayor Evans took her place behind the podium, adjusting the microphone before speaking. Good afternoon, she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. Today we have gathered in response to an incident that has shaken our community. Mr. Darnell Carter, a respected federal attorney, was wrongfully detained by our police department. This is unacceptable. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Mayor Evans continued, her voice firm. I want to be clear. We will not tolerate racial profiling or misconduct in this city's police department. I am ordering an immediate, independent investigation into this incident, and I can assure you that those responsible will be held accountable. This investigation will be transparent, and the results will be shared with the public. The crowd remained quiet, waiting for more. Mayor Evans turned to Darnell, gesturing for him to step forward. Darnell walked up to the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before he spoke. I appreciate the mayor's commitment to investigating this incident, Darnell began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. But this isn't just about me. This is about every black man and woman who has been stopped, questioned, or detained simply because they fit a description. This is about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for too long, and we will not stop until real change happens. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising with renewed energy. Darnell stepped back, letting the moment hang in the air. The mayor had made her promise, but the people would hold her, and the department, to it. As Darnell stood beside Mayor Evans, watching the crowd, he knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice had gained momentum, and there was no turning back now. The mayor's words echoed in the air long after the press conference ended. The crowd outside the station began to disperse slowly, but the energy hadn't diminished. There was a sense of cautious optimism, mixed with frustration. The promise of an investigation was a step, but Darnell knew, as did everyone else, that promises weren't enough. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Darnell lingered near the podium, watching the crowd as they started to thin out. Reporters buzzed around him, throwing out questions about what he thought of the mayor's statement, what his next steps would be. He gave them measured responses, knowing that every word he said now carried weight beyond this moment. The cameras were still rolling, and the people were listening. Lieutenant Thompson approached Darnell quietly as the reporters continued to swarm. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone low but steady. "The mayor made the right call, but I know this isn't over for you." Darnell nodded, his eyes still scanning the dispersing crowd. "It's not over for anyone. An investigation is just the beginning. What happens after that is what matters. The community won't be satisfied with just suspensions or empty gestures. They want to see real change." Thompson sighed, glancing toward the station. "I know, and I don't disagree. But it's going to take time. The system doesn't change overnight." Darnell turned to face her, his expression hard but calm. "That's the problem, isn't it? It's always going to take time. Meanwhile, people like me, people who look like me, are the ones paying the price for this so-called time." Thompson met his gaze, understanding the weight of his words. She had seen the system fail too many times before, even from the inside. "You're right," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "But we need you to stay engaged in this process. The city needs someone like you to keep pushing, to hold us accountable." Darnell's phone buzzed again in his pocket, another wave of texts and calls lighting up the screen. Word was spreading fast, and people were already asking what his next move would be. He knew that his role had shifted from lawyer to something bigger, an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but it was one he wasn't willing to walk away from. "I'm not going anywhere," Darnell said firmly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I'll be watching every step of this investigation, and I'll be making sure the community is involved. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." Thompson nodded. "That's exactly what this city needs right now." Before she could say anything more, Officer Stevens rushed over to them, looking tense and distracted. "Lieutenant, there's something you need to see," he said, his voice strained. Thompson frowned, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Stevens glanced nervously at Darnell before answering. "It's starting to spread online. There are people calling for more protests, but there's also talk of unrest. Some groups are saying the mayor's statement isn't enough, and they're planning to escalate." Darnell and Thompson exchanged a glance, the gravity of the situation settling between them. What had begun as a peaceful protest was now threatening to turn into something much more dangerous. The city was on the edge, and any misstep could ignite a fire that wouldn't be easily contained. "We need to get ahead of this," Darnell said, his voice calm but urgent. "If the people don't see results soon, they'll take matters into their own hands. The city can't afford that." Thompson nodded, her mind already racing with next steps. "I'll handle it," she said firmly. "We can't let this spiral out of control." As Stevens led Thompson away, Darnell stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle in once again. He knew that what happened next was critical, not just for him, but for the entire community. The promises made today were only the beginning, and the fight for justice had just begun. The tension in the air wasn't just local anymore. The incident had begun to spread across the country, lighting up social media feeds and news broadcasts nationwide. The footage of Darnell's arrest, combined with the growing demand for police reform, had struck a nerve. In the days following the mayor's speech, protests in cities far beyond their own erupted in solidarity. What had begun as a local issue was fast becoming a national conversation about race, policing, and justice. Inside the city, the pressure was building. The investigation into the officers involved was moving slowly, too slowly for the public's liking. And though the mayor had promised transparency, the community was growing restless. Every day that passed without concrete action felt like a betrayal to those who had gathered in the streets demanding change. Darnell found himself at the center of it all. His phone never stopped buzzing, with calls from journalists, activists, and even politicians wanting to use his story to amplify their own agendas. But Darnell wasn't interested in being used. He had one focus: making sure that the promises made during that tense afternoon outside the station weren't just words. Sitting in a meeting room at the community center, Darnell was surrounded by familiar faces: local activists, lawyers, and community leaders who had been fighting this battle long before his arrest. Maria Hernandez, a tireless advocate for police reform, was seated next to him, her eyes scanning a list of talking points for their upcoming meeting with city officials. "The pressure's mounting," Maria said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to keep pushing. The investigation can't drag on forever. And the people out there," she nodded toward the window where another crowd had gathered outside the center, "they're not going to wait much longer." Darnell leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He knew Maria was right. The community had given the mayor and the police department a chance to address the problem, but the clock was ticking. "I've been getting calls from people outside the city," Darnell said. "Other organizations are reaching out, offering to help, but we need to stay focused on what we're asking for here. Real reform, not just symbolic gestures." Maria looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's a delicate balance, though. The media attention is good. It keeps the pressure on, but we can't let them turn this into just another story. We have to control the narrative." Darnell nodded, his mind turning over the next steps. The investigation had to be thorough, but it also had to be swift. The longer it dragged on, the more likely the city was to see another round of protests, and this time they might not be as peaceful. The unrest that Stevens had warned them about was still a very real threat. Suddenly the door to the meeting room opened, and Malik Johnson, a local activist who had been working closely with Darnell and Maria, entered, his expression serious. "You guys need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. "A video just dropped. It's footage from a different angle of the arrest. It shows the officers handling you, Darnell, before they even asked you any questions. It's bad." Darnell exchanged a look with Maria, then took Malik's phone and played the video. It was shaky, recorded from across the street, but clear enough to show Officer Grant and Officer Taylor approaching Darnell, their body language aggressive from the start. The footage didn't show Darnell resisting. In fact, it showed him complying, just as he had said all along. But the aggression of the officers was undeniable. "This changes everything," Darnell said quietly, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about my word against theirs anymore. This is proof." Maria leaned over to watch the video again, her eyes narrowing. "This puts even more pressure on the department. If they don't act now, they're going to lose whatever credibility they have left." Darnell nodded, his mind racing. This was the break they had been waiting for, but it also meant that the stakes had just been raised. The department could no longer afford to stall. The city's leaders had to respond, and soon. "It's time to go public with this," Darnell said, standing up. "We can't sit on this video. The community deserves to see it, and the department needs to be held accountable. We'll make sure they can't ignore this." Maria nodded in agreement. "Let's get ahead of this. We'll organize another press conference. This time, we're not waiting for the mayor or the police. We're going to lead." As they prepared to go public with the video, Darnell knew they were about to push the city into an even more intense spotlight. But this time, they had the evidence to back them up. The next morning, the city woke up to the video of Darnell's arrest circulating across every major social media platform. The video, showing the rough treatment by the officers before any questions were even asked, was damning. It wasn't just a confirmation of Darnell's account. It was irrefutable evidence of the systemic issues he and the community had been fighting against for years. By midday, the footage had reached national news networks, triggering another wave of outrage. At the community center, Darnell, Maria, and Malik prepared for the press conference they had called. They knew this moment was critical. How they handled the release of the video could shape the direction of the movement. The stakes were higher than ever, and the department had been backed into a corner. The crowd outside the community center was growing. News vans lined the street, and reporters were setting up, eager to capture the next development in what had become a national story. "Everyone's watching," Maria said, pacing slightly as she scanned her notes. "This isn't just a local issue anymore. The country's looking to us to see how we respond." Darnell nodded, standing by the window and looking out at the swelling crowd. He knew that the video had changed the game. The public had seen for themselves what so many had experienced in silence for years. But he also knew this wasn't the time to celebrate. It was just another step in a much longer journey. "We have to be strategic," Darnell said, turning away from the window. "This video gives us leverage, but we can't let it turn into a spectacle. We need to keep the focus on the reforms we're demanding." Maria nodded in agreement. "Exactly. The last thing we want is for this to be turned into just another media frenzy. We have a clear message. This video proves what we've been saying all along. Now we need the department to act." As the time for the press conference approached, the tension in the air grew thicker. Darnell could hear the chants from the crowd outside. People were angry, and rightfully so. The release of the video had reignited the outrage that had been simmering since the day of his arrest. "Let's get this started," Malik said, checking his watch. "The reporters are ready." The three of them stepped outside to the makeshift podium in front of the community center. The crowd, sensing the importance of the moment, quieted down as the cameras zoomed in. All eyes focused on Darnell. Taking a deep breath, Darnell stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "As many of you have seen, a video of my arrest has surfaced. This footage shows exactly what happened, how I was treated, how the officers escalated the situation without cause, and how this has become a reflection of the larger problem in our city's police department." The crowd murmured in agreement, the anger and frustration palpable in the air. "This video is more than just evidence of what happened to me," Darnell continued. "It's proof of what happens to countless others who don't have cameras recording their every move. This isn't just about me. It's about ending a pattern of injustice." The press clicked their cameras, reporters furiously taking notes, and the crowd swelled in support. The release of the video had given them undeniable evidence, but Darnell knew the fight was far from over. "The community has made its demands clear," Darnell said, his voice rising. "We want real reform, independent oversight of the police, accountability for misconduct, and an end to racial profiling. And we won't stop until those demands are met." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices filling the air with determination. As Darnell stepped back from the podium, he knew the pressure on the department had just intensified. The city couldn't ignore them any longer. As the press conference ended, the city seemed to be teetering on the edge of something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The release of the video had escalated the situation, forcing city leaders into an uncomfortable spotlight. The footage couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or speculation. It was clear evidence that the police department had crossed a line, and now the public was demanding justice more forcefully than ever. The city's leadership, meanwhile, was scrambling. Inside City Hall, meetings were held behind closed doors, with the mayor, police chief, and legal advisors all trying to navigate the rapidly growing crisis. They had expected backlash, but the speed and scale of it had taken them by surprise. What had begun as a local arrest had exploded into a national conversation, and the city was under intense pressure to respond. At the community center, Darnell sat with Maria and Malik, debriefing after the press conference. The room buzzed with phone calls and activity as they tried to keep up with the flood of media requests and messages of support from organizations around the country. The video had given their movement new momentum, but it also came with increased scrutiny. "The mayor can't stay silent much longer," Maria said, glancing up from her phone. "People are already questioning why there hasn't been more action. The video is out there for everyone to see, but we haven't heard a word from her since that initial press conference." Darnell nodded, running a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in from the non-stop pace of the last few days. "She's backed into a corner. They're probably trying to figure out how to spin this, but there's no way around it anymore. The department has to take responsibility. Malik, leaning back in his chair, shook his head. The longer they wait, the worse it's going to get. If they don't act soon, the protests are going to ramp up. People are already calling for citywide marches. Darnell understood the urgency. The community had given the city enough time to act, and patience was wearing thin. The pressure from activists and citizens was growing by the hour, and the media was fanning the flames, covering the story with non-stop updates. Every delay, every moment of silence from city leadership only deepened the public's anger. "I think it's time we start preparing for the next phase," Darnell said finally, his voice low but decisive. "The department's going to drag its feet, and the mayor's going to try to avoid making any real commitments. We can't let this lose momentum. We need to take the next step." Maria looked up, her expression serious. "What are you thinking?" Darnell straightened in his chair. "A citywide march. We bring together the community, activists, and supporters from across the city. This isn't just about what happened to me anymore. It's about police misconduct across the board. If they won't take action, we need to force their hand." Malik's face lit up with determination. "That's exactly what we need to do. Show them that we're not going to sit back and wait. We'll take this to the streets." Maria nodded in agreement. "We'll start organizing it right away. The people are ready, and they've been waiting for a chance to show their strength." Darnell leaned forward, a sense of clarity settling over him. The city had been slow to respond, but they weren't going to wait any longer. The movement had gained national attention, and now it was time to turn that energy into action. The march would be their next step, a powerful display of unity and resistance. The fight for justice wasn't just happening inside meeting rooms anymore. It was about to unfold in the streets. The day of the citywide march arrived with a palpable energy hanging in the air. Streets that were normally bustling with cars and pedestrians were now filled with people holding signs, chanting slogans, and demanding change. What had begun as a local issue was now a massive movement that stretched across the city's neighborhoods, uniting people from all walks of life. The marchers gathered in the heart of downtown, where they would make their way to City Hall in a peaceful but powerful demonstration of unity. Darnell stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by Maria, Malik, and other community leaders. The sheer size of the crowd was overwhelming. Thousands had shown up, not just from the city but from nearby towns and cities. It was a clear message. This wasn't just a local fight. It was a movement that spoke to a nationwide call for justice. Looking out over the sea of faces, Darnell felt a surge of emotion. He had never expected to be thrust into the center of something this big. What had started as a routine, if unjust arrest had now become a flashpoint for a larger conversation about systemic change. But as the crowd's chants of justice for all echoed through the streets, Darnell knew that this moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about every person who had been wronged by the system and never had the chance to tell their story. Maria stepped up next to him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the massive crowd. "You did this, Darnell." He shook his head slightly. "We did this. The community did this. And it's not over yet." At that moment, a volunteer signaled that it was time to begin the march. The crowd slowly started moving, led by Darnell and the other leaders. The atmosphere was charged but peaceful. People walked with determination, their signs held high, their voices carrying over the city's skyline. News helicopters hovered overhead, capturing the historic moment, while reporters walked alongside the march, documenting every step. As they moved through the city, the crowd only seemed to grow. People lined the streets, some joining the march, others cheering from the sidelines. It was a show of solidarity unlike anything the city had seen in years, and the message was clear. The people were no longer willing to wait for justice. They were demanding it. When the march reached City Hall, the crowd filled the square in front of the building. Darnell, Maria, and Malik made their way to the podium that had been set up, ready to address the gathered masses and the officials who were watching from the steps of City Hall. The mayor stood at the entrance, flanked by the police chief and other city leaders, their faces tense as they took in the sheer size of the crowd. Darnell stepped up to the microphone, the weight of the moment settling over him. The chants slowly died down, and an expectant silence fell over the crowd as everyone waited for him to speak. He took a deep breath, looking out over the sea of faces, and began. "Today," he said, his voice carrying through the air, "we are here to demand the change that our community has needed for far too long. What started as a wrongful arrest has revealed something much deeper. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that has failed us time and time again." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on him. "We're here today because we refuse to accept a system that allows injustice to flourish," Darnell continued. "We're here because we believe that change is possible, and we won't stop until that change is real. We won't stop until there's true accountability, transparency, and reform. We are not asking for justice anymore. We are demanding it." A cheer erupted from the crowd, their energy surging back to life. "The community has made its demands clear," Darnell said, raising his voice to meet the rising energy of the crowd. "Independent oversight, accountability for misconduct, and an end to racial profiling. And we will not stop until these demands are met. This is our city, and we have the power to change it." As Darnell stepped back from the podium, the crowd roared in approval. The people standing behind him, activists, community leaders, citizens, clapped and raised their fists in solidarity. It was a moment of triumph, but Darnell knew it was also just the beginning of the next phase. The march had shown the power of the people, but the fight for lasting reform was still ahead. Mayor Evans stepped up to the podium next, her expression a mixture of resolve and acknowledgement. She addressed the crowd, echoing many of Darnell's points and promising swift action, but the people remained watchful. They had heard promises before. This time, they would hold their city's leadership accountable. As the event wound down, Darnell walked to the edge of the stage, taking in the sight of the crowd one last time. The voices of the people, unified in their call for change, filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, Darnell felt a glimmer of hope. The movement they had built was strong, and the momentum was real. As Maria and Malik joined him, they exchanged glances, exhausted but determined. They had taken the first step in what would be a long journey, but they weren't walking alone. The people were with them, and they would keep pushing until justice was more than just a word spoken at podiums. It would be a lived reality for everyone. If this story gripped you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you captivating new stories every day. Stay tuned for more.